All right, so there are folders. The PowerPoint is going to have like a little opener video, and then that's it. So this is your PowerPoint today. So you want to get your hands on one of these. This is a lot more content than we will be able to cover tonight. We're just going to overview a lot of what's in here, and then this becomes something you can take home. Hopefully, it starts some good conversations tonight. Hopefully, it starts some good conversations down the road. So, big thing is you want to get this. So last week we talked about the Matthew model of discipleship and how our heart has been to apply that into our church. So tonight I want to overview some of the work we've done in structuring Christ House to try and make it conducive to using that model. And so I've got a lot. What you have in your hand in this folder is a resource manual, just where I've been taking a bunch of the stuff that I made. So some of this stuff was made before we launched the church. Some of this stuff was made in the first 2 years of the church as we were training folks. And some of it's been made more recently. Some has been just made in the last couple of years, extra handouts that got tacked on. So let me talk a bit about how we got here and how you end up with, there's like 20 pages of material in there. I did not set out to be a pastor or to start a church. My heart had been discipleship. That's my background, working with the drama ministry. And then through the drama ministry, we were part of a network of different mime and theater teams that were committed to discipleship. And I was recruited by our parent ministry to help them flesh out discipleship and teach it to the other teams. And so I was already developing curriculums to use for my mime team here in Pennsylvania on how we teach discipleship to our leaders. And that's where the Matthew model began. I wrote up a draft of it and sent it out to our headquarters in Missouri because they were asking for feedback from the teams on what could be a unifying standard of discipleship. At that point, their board adopted it and invited me to become part of the national staff. Initially, they wanted me to move out to Missouri. I turned them down. They convinced me to step on as sort of the pastor for the ministry overseeing discipleship, just to resource teams. So that was kind of, that's just sort of where I was hanging out. During that time in our local ministries, we had teams in Reading, Lancaster, and York. And in the York team, I was struggling to raise up male leadership. And so from a discipleship point of view, how do you raise up leaders? You got to have leaders to raise them up. I had some strong ladies. The church we were partnering with, the pastor's daughters were on the team, and we're raising up a lot of ladies. And I just, inner city context, didn't have any strong dads. So I started leaning into that church personally to invest in the guys. So eventually I began attending the church, which was St. Paul EC Church in York, full-time, and they made me an associate pastor to work with the youth. And it was basically me saying, hey, I want all the opportunities to disciple the young teenage guys that I can get to disciple up leaders. So that was sort of how I sneakily became a pastor. That wasn't what I was trying to do, but they're like, well, if you're here, can we use you? And if we're going to let you run the youth group, Sunday school class and stuff, we'd like to call you an associate pastor. Okay. So that got me into the office, got me working on stuff. At that point, the conversation sort of started evolving. Pastor Carlos Kelly over in York was talking about them trying to do some more discipleship in the main church. And so he had asked if I was willing to consult on some of that. And again, discipleship's my thing, so yeah, okay. And I remember the conversation started as, look, I'm not looking to pastor anything, but I don't mind consulting. And the conversation began as us maybe starting a second service with a discipleship emphasis. And then that grew into saying, let's do a church plant and just start something from ground zero with this baked in. Because the conversation, we talked a lot about how hard it is to take something that's established and has momentum and then change it drastically. And he said, and so Carlos's take was, look, if we want to really radically commit to discipleship, let's start fresh. And then, we've got all the room. So again, they asked, would I continue consulting? And I was. And that was where God began to work on my heart to make me willing to actually be willing to pastor it. And so I actually had a sabbatical in there, took some time praying, and really felt like the Lord was leading me to be willing to change up, because the whole time I'd always said, I can consult, I will help, I want to disciple some of your teenagers, but like, this is your baby, and you got to find somebody to run it. So, so I began having a lot of meetings and typing up material to flesh out how we would do that. So I want to actually open this. Part of why I give you all that backstory is, in that process, I made a little video. It was like a promo video for the discipleship service that later became the Discipleship Church plant, that became the next step in Christ House. We ended up doing 2 church plants, York and Lancaster, and I was driving back and forth, and then we trained up leadership for the York one to hand off, and I stayed with Lancaster with Christ House. So we're going to watch a little video about the St. Paul discipleship service. Cornelia saw it, and she goes, "Oh, are you doing the discipleship thing with St. Paul over in Rossville?" Now, this is St. Paul EC in York. And this video, my voice will sound a little different, is from 10 years ago. And part of why I thought it'd be fun to start here is, one, this is what we were thinking about. At this point, there is no church, no next step, no Christ House. This is what we're envisioning. But I think as you listen to it, you'll go, yeah, that's what we're trying to do. It should be pretty familiar. So let's go ahead and let the video be our little starter.
St. Paul EC is doing something new. We're calling it a discipleship service. Let me tell you a little about what guided us in designing this service, how a discipleship service should work, and how we hope to get there. So let's talk a little bit about our values. There are 2 main things that really shaped what we want to do in the service. Our primary values are discipleship and worship. We define discipleship as the hands-on approach that Jesus used in training up the 12 disciples, and worship as our appropriate response to God's revelation of himself. We think these 2 ideas overlap quite a bit. When they do, they give us an ideal way to do church. Following from our 2 main values, there are 2 resulting values. The first is family. Throughout the Bible, family is often the context in which worship happens, and throughout the New Testament, disciples are referred to as a family. Family is the basic way the Bible looks at people and how God organized us to grow and function. So our service needs to be more than a corporate event or an academic lecture. It needs to be a family gathering. Family is where you are your normal self. Despite how you might look at work or on special occasions, your family sees you when you just woke up, when things are good, when things aren't. As a family, we expect you to just be who you really are, authentic, honest. But being family isn't just knowing each other well. It's also about commitment. Our biological families give us an idea of what our church family is like. Membership in a family isn't something you earn, but rather comes by birth. And no matter how well or poorly we get along, we're supposed to be committed to each other. The same is true for all those who have been spiritually born into the family of God. We don't get to pick them, and they don't have to deserve it. If we're family, then we have an obligation to stand with each other and for each other. We're committed to the family, and the family's committed to us. More could be said on all of that, but this is just an overview. The second resulting value that we draw from worship and discipleship is that teaching and worship are incomplete if there is no practice. It's not enough for us to just come and listen. There has to be an expectation that we will also go and do. It's in applying the truth together that we understand it more fully and worship sincerely. We're going to need to have an emphasis on being practical. We're not talking about just hollowing out our sermons with shallow moralizing, but rather taking good messages and finishing them by modeling the truths while preaching them, then participating together in the practice of that truth so that over time, you don't just get a lot of head knowledge, but the truth of God becomes a part of your personality and lifestyle. Worship and discipleship have to leave the service or they're both incomplete. So, those are the ideas that guide us in creating the discipleship service. But what does it look like when you put it all together? Let's look a little at how we think a discipleship service could run. Because of our values, we're committed to making the main service into an environment where we can form and launch the committed family groups that we just talked about. So we view the main service as more of an incubator for discipleship groups. It's where the community is modeled, our values are passed to the groups, and skills are taught. Everything a group needs should be modeled in the service to some degree. So if we zoom in a little closer, what we're seeing is the service is a training environment for family groups. It's a place where they can participate in the elements of the Christian life together. The service is designed as a prayer, not merely including prayer, because all of life and ministry should be defined by our fellowship with the Father. So we open and close our gatherings as though we are starting and concluding a prayer. We give opportunity for response to the teaching right there in the service every week, so that we are practicing together the lifestyle of worship. In all of this, our focus is that we do it together. Participation should be the norm. And this is because discipleship needs to be hands-on. We're not fans of an environment where everyone sits and listens while one person talks or sings. We want our prayers to be done corporately, and our Bible readings to include the whole group speaking the scriptures to each other. When we sing, we want to pick songs that everyone can join in on, so that in each of these aspects, the entire congregation is engaging the truth with more than just their ears. This changes how we approach teaching as well. We'll still have a sermon, but it's going to be a little different. Basically, it breaks down into multiple segments. In the preaching part, we want there to be an emphasis on helping the congregation understand how to interpret Scripture, working through the context and other issues related to a passage so that it is ready to be applied to life. From there, the pastor will allow the groups to ask questions to make sure they understand the passage correctly and help them with any parts that are confusing. The discussion then transitions into their smaller groups where application is made to our actual lives instead of hypothetical scenarios or other people. But not just the individual, our groups are challenged to take from the passage applications that they can do together. So discipleship requiring hands-on and worship requiring a response leads us to this multi-segmented style of sermon that begins with the pastor preaching, then to him interacting with the whole congregation, equipping them to study the text, then breaks out into the groups where it informs what they will do that week. There's an expectation that you will apply things every week. The group serves as an accountability so that this is more than just empty words. That's what we hope a discipleship service will look like. But how do we get there? Let's take a final moment to explain the process of getting there. If you come and visit our discipleship service, you'll find us in one of the following 3 phases. Basically, we want to grow the ministry from within the main service so that when it's all formed, our values are consistent across the whole ministry. So the process is focused on multiplying groups from one service into multiple ministries. Phase 1 is where the main service is the first group. At this point, it's led by the pastor, just one group. We don't plan for it to stay there. This group is meant to develop future group leaders. In time, the service will move from one group to several. At this point, the pastor isn't leading any one group, but is free to move between them and help where needed. What we're doing is letting the groups develop and grow in a mentored environment. Finally, at phase 3, the groups begin to regularly meet outside the main service. They'll still be there on Sunday, but fully formed mature groups are meeting for fellowship and ministry at various times throughout the week. As members find groups that they link in with, either because of similar ministry passions or compatible schedules, the discipleship and worship reach a fuller expression as they have more of their lives shared. More time living out and responding to God's Word in the day-to-day of life within a family-style community. So that's the plan. It's more about building it right than building it fast. These are phases, not a timetable. We've got a lot to do and a lot to learn. So come join us for the St. Paul EC Discipleship Service.
All right. So as you look at that, as you listen through that, as I said, that was made. This is what happens when you ask a graphic guy to be on your brainstorming crew. Before you get a document, you get a video. And you can hear it's draft state. There's words that are being put up. So the point of it was just to throw the ideas out and get it formed, because we've been having lots of meetings. I had all these different notes. So what I want to start, just pause here, as you watch that, and you're watching it and thinking about what we do here at Christ House 10 years later. What are some of the things that jumped out to you? If someone wants to hit that light in the back. I don't have to sit in the shade the whole time.
Like intentionally making it where you don't have to feel like you have to dress fancy if that's not really who you are, or not that you can't dress fancy, but
it was kind of funny when St. Paul EC in Rossville. By the way, we name a ton of our churches St. Paul. St. Paul and Grace are like half the denomination, maybe more. So when St. Paul Rossville hired me, Terry Markson, was our lay delegate, so she'd known me 10 years ago, known me 12 years ago, because I'd go out to EC conference and I'd see her there. And she was talking about how one of the things that surprised her when she met me for the interview, for them to hire me, was when she knew me 12, 13 years ago, I was the young guy who came to conference wearing a bow tie and a button-up shirt, was one of the best dressed young guys. I have no issue dressing up. I have no issue with ties. I know how to tie multiple kinds of ties. My bow ties are hand-tied, and I usually sew them myself. So, this wasn't I just hate dressing up. This was a missions decision where I went, if we're going to make this environment work the way I think it needs to work, I need to model what I'm asking. And I think people come in, there's a sense in which if there's a bow tie sitting at a table or two, that's not going to mess anything up. But if you come in and everybody up front is dressed to the nines and you're not, you go, oh, whoops. Because like in the drama industry, we go to lots of churches. And that's one of our big questions. Okay, a church booked us. And I remember, the one time my team's all got their matching uniform, but I'm the one speaking. And I walk in, and I've got a polo shirt on and some jeans. And I realize there's not another man in the building who doesn't have a tie on. Everybody has a sport coat, collared shirt, and tie. I'm thinking, whoops, I usually kept a sport coat in my car as a backup, because you at least throw that on, and because you had that feeling like, I'm probably going to get in trouble. If I get up there and talk the way I'm dressed now, they're all going to be distracted by just going, what's this guy doing here? And if I feel that as an invited guest, what's the rest of the group feel? So we've tried to think on some of those things. I don't think it's a big deal in the sense of like you're not sinning either way. But we were asking what's the culture we want to cultivate. We wanted people to feel like they could be themselves. And I'd recognize clothing is often expression of your personality and tastes and things. And so, yeah, that was something we talked about back then, and I made changes. I bought clothes in response to that. I used to dress up exclusively.
One of the things I appreciate and hope we never get away from is our discussion groups during the service.
Well, did you see that was part of the plan from before we ever started? So we want to be groups, a gathering of groups, and we want participation. And so we, right off the bat, we're like, if it's just preaching where I talk, how do we say it's discipleship if you do nothing? And I get the discussion groups don't get to full application, but it's way further than we normally do in a church setting.
I mention that when I invite somebody to church, that what makes us different is you'll have a chance to ask the minister questions during the service.
Well, that was something I wondered if anyone caught. The original vision there had the sermon really in like sort of there was more phases than we currently have. It had me preaching, then me doing Q&A with the whole group, and then the group breaking out into small groups. And for those of you that were there at the very beginning, we did that. Why don't we do it now? Because I think when I watched that video, if you said anything on there that we said we want to do that we're not doing now, that would be about the only thing I saw that was like, oh, it's time. How long did some of those early teaching sessions go?
I learned how to keep dinners warm for a long time.
That's a challenge.
You have two interactive elements. It's almost impossible to know how long it's going to go. Because you could say any questions, and maybe we get two, and we break to groups. Or maybe we get a lot. Or Tom asks a question, which gets you thinking of a question, and we get this little... And it would be really fun. You'd lose track of time. But that was the problem. You'd lose track of time, and we'd go, here you had a half hour to 45 minutes of teaching, and then we just did 45 minutes of Q&A with the pastor, and you're going to still go to a group discussion? So sometimes the group discussions didn't even happen because we Q&A'd till we were out of time. Now, some of that you saw in the original vision was the first group is the whole church together. So when we started, that was fine. We Q&A'd, and that was your discussion group. But as the discussion groups started to mature and have good discussions on their own, then the discussion with the pastor was crowding, and that was a growth we wanted. We wanted those groups happening. That's moving from phase 1 to phase 2. So it really was as we matured into phase 2 that the pastor Q&A trimmed out. Now, we still have a culture that says you can ask questions, and every so often, middle of a sermon, someone goes, hey, Noah asked a question the other week. I hope we keep that always okay. And we've had a couple times where we sneak back into it. During COVID, we did a lot more Q&A with the pastor built into the sermons. So there's been places where we put it there.
During the early part of learning how to do groups in the service, there was also in that phase, you talked about the different discipleship phases of launching it. There was a lot of, hey, Tim, during the group time, we were calling you over to answer questions, and as the whole church matured in how to do the groups, we don't need to do that as often, but we still feel like we could. But
well, I appreciate you're hitting on. So the heart of it is this is about discipleship, right? And one of the things we see in discipleship is things are modeled, and then they're shared, and then they're released. So the disciples don't just get sink or swimmed into preach the gospel to all nations. They walk with Jesus, and early on in the Gospels particularly, they're doing very, very little. Jesus is preaching, and they are tagging along and asking lots of questions. But then later, we see them sharing in the ministry. They're distributing the bread. At times he's even saying, you feed them and letting them make decisions. Later, we have times where they're doing miracles. They're sent out to preach. They're casting out demons. Some of the stories we have of their failures where they couldn't cast out a demon or couldn't heal a kid, that's happening because we've now gotten to a normal place in the ministry where the crowds gather and the disciples start ministry, doing miracles. And then when it doesn't work, okay, go get Jesus. So we see that flow of model, share, release in the Gospels. So early on, more Q&A for me. Some of that was just for me to model. How do you answer these questions? How do you roll with a tough question? How do you not freak out when you get a mean question? That presents a picture for you. Or sometimes you'd ask a question and I'd just ask a question back. And you're learning by watching how to run a group. Then we moved to shared where you guys are running, but you're right. I didn't go somewhere else. I floated and stayed very, very close. Then there did come a point, and we're there, where I very intentionally make myself less available. Right now, when you guys are doing your groups, I'm back teaching the kids. Now, obviously, my goal is to model, share, release back there too, but that also pulls me out of the way where you guys run your groups. So yeah, that heart of discipleship really flows into why we pivot a bit in how we roll with that. Now, if we were really struggling and we had a lot of people move on and I need to train up fresh, I think you'd see me pull back in, and we've had some of that back and forth.
I was just going to say, I don't interrupt the service as much as I used to, and part of that is because I've heard you teaching, and I know what you're saying and where you're going, sometimes, but I do kind of miss those interruptions, and I think, you could consciously bring some of it, not in the sense of like, well, I guess what I'm thinking is it's like when you do like a 3-part sermon or whatever, like at the end of each part, does everybody understand? Is there any questions?
Right. Still bring back some places where we can do some of that.
I don't know that everybody, every single time you would ask that, you would get interrupted, but I think it would, I do miss it, and I do think it's a unique part of our service, and because the discussion time happens after your sermon, I don't think new people realize that, like, oh, I could have asked.
You could have said something, yeah.
Right, that
because it's not our default church culture, right? Like, the odds that you've got somebody, if they have any church experience in their background, that they went to a church where you could have asked a question during a sermon, not likely. Usually you're like, if I did that, I'm going to get in trouble. Whereas you just won't hear. 100%, someone will thank you afterwards.
The first time, like early on when we were starting to come and somebody did interrupt you during a service and ask you a question and you answered and it was normal and then you continued on, I was shocked. Nobody does that in churches, but I like that was okay.
Yeah, when it hits on, you learn it by modeling, right? You saw it and went, oh, then that can be done. And you have to see it. We could say it. We could even put a poster up here that says you can ask questions. And who's going to be gutsy enough to do it if they don't see it happen and it goes well?
I say that's where you, like if somebody new is here, like we had, 2 weeks, we've had a couple of new people, here, like when they're brand new, like that would be a good time to purposely say, does anybody have any, before I go to point number 2, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah. So currently what we're doing is I've downplayed it to give more group time. Because we have healthy groups, my big concern is if I take too much of that for myself, I steal from the groups. And when we didn't have groups, there was nothing to steal from. When the groups weren't, strong, that was almost a relief. If I don't give them too much time, they don't have to struggle too long. We're now at a point where I could let the groups go as long as, like, no matter how much time I give them, they use it. And I peek my ear in from time to time, and I'm always going, oh, these are fun conversations. So that's the tension. So what I've been trying to do now is more give pockets. I mean, obviously there is the openness, they can ask a question anytime. But like when we preached to the biblical worship series, there was several places where we stopped and opened for questions, kind of, like you said, at the end of segments. Things like this. Because we didn't have Winter Institute back in the day, we just had small groups. But going and having a Wednesday night class type setting where I do go ahead and just, I'm here and we can dialogue like this, gives a place for that. It's not the same place, but we're saying, well, yeah, it matters to us. We want to keep fitting it in. I think it's a good problem that we're having to juggle multiple good things now. But yeah, I agree. We don't want to lose that entirely.
Yeah, I think that the group time, the group discussion time, still, and having the freedom to ask questions to you during the service, they both have that element of participation.
Right.
So they're both meeting that cultural value, and so yeah, if we're more heavy on the group time, that's still being met.
Right. They come from the same value, so it's not are we doing that value? It's just how are we doing it, and asking which ways are best. And that might vary by topic. Like, because I could envision when we're doing a week where we're getting into, like, for instance, maybe do some self-critique here. When we were going through Matthew, we had that segment where we went through Matthew's end times bit. That would be a good time to lean more into the pastor Q&A, because I don't expect every group leader to be ready to have an end times theology discussion. But I hope that you're all ready to talk about, praying for your family and sharing your faith. Like most of the applications, I don't think you need to go to Bible college to have this discussion. Every once in a while you get one where, so one of the values we saw in Matthew is that a leader creates a safe community and there's times where heavy questions would come in and Jesus would defend his disciples. So like the disciples start breaking a lot of the law before they seem to understand why they might not keep all of it. So like they're going through the fields and they're grabbing grain and it's on the Sabbath. And literally, if you read the Mishnah, the writings of the Pharisees, they had spelled out what does and does not constitute gleaning on the Sabbath, and what they're doing is a direct violation of the tradition. So everybody around knew the Pharisees would count that as work. And so most people would have known and grown up with the tradition of not doing it. Jesus' disciples have already departed from the Mishnah. They've already left. So in being with Jesus, they've picked up a way of living that has some solid theology on how we engage the Old Testament and what we are and are not doing with the traditions. And so, not surprisingly, the Pharisees asked, "Teacher, why do your disciples work on the Sabbath?" And they start grumbling at the disciples. And he doesn't let the disciples say a word in that chapter. He goes and he gives what is a heavy theological response. He talks about the Sabbath being made for man and something better than the Sabbath being here, and then he talks about the Queen of Sheba and something better than the wisdom of Solomon being here. He lays out a theology of Jesus, the fulfillment of the law, that is heavy lifting theology as far as Old Testament interpreted in light of Jesus. And he's doing that in defense of his disciples' behavior. So in discipling them, he's pulled them out of what's safe and comfortable, and then he doesn't leave them to just, all right, well, have fun with the Pharisees. I got you in trouble, but it's your baby. And I think that's part of making that safe community is they could walk with Jesus. They could step out of what was familiar, start doing things they used to think you're not supposed to do, and he wasn't going to leave them hanging. So I think there's a place as a leader, not just as the pastor, but as leaders in a discipleship ministry to say, is this one we let folks flounder on so they can grow, or is this one that we go, I'll take that one. Let me cover this so that you're not feeling hurt and like, oh, you ran me out somewhere vulnerable and left me hanging and I felt like an idiot. So like end times theology, I think solidly is that kind of stuff where I would say, I'm not going to run you out into a deep end times theology and then leave you hanging. That would be a good place to say, yeah, the pastor's here. Ask that hard question up here. We'll all discuss it together, but I'll be present so you got some coverage. Or I'll make sure I've got somebody who's got the chops for it, here and while I'm off somewhere else. So those are places where I think more like, so if I would do it again, I think that might have been one where we could have said, hey, let's not do small groups this week. I'd have to arrange for someone else to be with the kids, and I'd say, let me just move to the middle and let's discuss. And we probably would have had a blast. And that would have matched our value well, but a good disciple opportunity. Any other thoughts as you watched the video, just what you saw in it, either things you saw in there you said, oh, here's how we do that, or you went, do we do this or that part that was in the video, or just stuff that encouraged you?
One thing that I saw in the video that just stuck out was like mentioning accountability with groups, and it was like not so much like you do that some, but it's more like
Can you speak
one-on-one situation. I feel like in our groups I guess I'm more wondering which that was like, because I feel like we haven't done it as well as I.
So one of the aspects of groups and that family-like group is there's an accountability when when we're authentic and we're honest. Again, we're saying we want groups because we want to be people who don't just hear, but hear, process, and apply. Groups can give an accountability to that. Because in a normal setting, if I preach and a bunch of people come, and I've preached at like conferences and stuff, I have no way of knowing if anybody applies anything. So we thought, well, groups are better for that. But they're not automatically better at that. You can still go to a group, talk about doing stuff, and have no follow-up. So how do we get that built in? Well, the two thoughts we had, we can talk, I'd love to hear more ideas. It's part of why you hear me talk so much about wanting group applications over individual applications. So if we all meet and you say, well, I'm going to pray more this week and I'm going to read my Bible more this week, the only way I can really hold you accountable is just to ask you next week, did you pray more? Did you read your Bible more? If I remember. And even then, if you say yes, I didn't see you do it. I don't know if it went well. 'Cause I think of working with youth, one kid talked about having a bad attitude towards his parents. He wanted to work on that, right? So, okay, we'll pray for you, and he's going to try harder this week. How did it go? I think it went better. Well, but ask his mom. He might think it went better. She might have felt like there was no difference. And the things he was trying on and thought he made improvement weren't the things that really mattered. And so this is when accountability is only report back. That's actually it's at least some accountability, but it's like the bottom rung, weakest level. When we do applications together, I see you do it, and you see me do it. That's automatic accountability. Because if we get done, I go, I just think we were so gracious to the community. And you're like, I actually thought that was a really offensive outreach. That one guy walked away mad at you. Did you see that? No, I didn't see that. Okay. And so by doing it together where we see each other, there's conversations we had. Tom has talked about some of his favorite moments in Christ House. We're going places and having someone like him and Joe, because of a group, their small group, talked about different things they want to do in the community, so they went out to a gathering where the mayor was talking, and Tom responded a certain way that Joe felt was very irreverent, and Joe called him out. Now, I wasn't there, so I'm on the weak level accountability. I don't know if it was irreverent. But here's the thing. Tom could have gone to that meeting alone, come back and told Joe, I went, it was a great meeting, and they loved me. And that is not how Joe would have felt about the meeting if he was there. By being there, they had a conversation that wouldn't have happened if they were doing individual applications.
Here's one of my best friends.
Right. Tom walked away going, I have somebody who actually speaks into my life. I'm home. He has not left since. Right? Because that's meaning. We do need that. That's not a bad thing. If I've got blind spots, the only way I can find out is if somebody helps me see it. So group applications is a big part of it. Now, at various times I have encouraged our group leaders to go ahead and take notes. There are some questions you just are going to have to ask. We do want everyone in our church to have a personal accountability partner. That's one of the things we encourage. How do we follow up on that? I usually ask group leaders to just see if everybody in their group has one, and that's just a question you can ask. So we do some of that, and that's where group leaders being intentional. I think that's the better environment, because if I try and do an ask here, I've got 35 people to chase down. Whereas if I say, hey, group leaders, can you just check that everybody in your group, find out if they've currently got an accountability partner, you're following up with 6 to 8 people. So we see the groups as a good place, but it does come down to whether group leaders know what they're supposed to be asking, are reminded and supported in that, and are doing it. And we always have groups in Christ House. We don't always have groups meeting during the week. We go back and forth between phase 2 and 3. So every week there's groups here in the room. But probably when we're doing our sermon discussion, you weren't going to pause and say, by the way, just before we wrap up, does everybody here have accountability partners? Because you use the whole time just discussing the sermon. So that's where you kind of have to get out into phase 3 for that to really work. But yeah, that's how we're going for it. That's why I'm so big on group applications. So I know that can feel weird because you guys are like, I had a solid, deep, meaningful, biblical, personal application, and Tim just didn't count it. I'm not against it. I just think from a discipleship point of view, we get so much more done with a group application. And I want you to grow.
I was going to change the subject.
But anything from the video, otherwise I'm going to move to the booklet. But you can
And
do
I'm not
something
sure-
else from the video.
I'm not sure if it was in the video or not, to be honest with you, but I like how we do prayer. And I hope as we do get bigger, it's going to be more difficult, but I hope we don't ever get away from truly having an individual time.
You mean the prayer request time?
Right, because, even the corporate prayers, I like that too, but I was talking about the family prayer time. And what I like about that is even if I don't know you well enough, almost every week we get a smattering from the entire crowd. I can't think of a week or a month that's gone by that somebody hasn't said something. So I get to know them through what they're saying as their prayer request. And when you get to the point that it's like, well, we're going to pray now, and it's just like, yeah, Lord bless our group, and and that's all that's said. Well, I think the reason we're a close group is because we do know the ins and outs of what's happening with everybody. And like I said, I can see if we get to be 75 people every week, we might have to change the format a little bit because prayer time will turn out to be an hour,
And you hear the values, right? We wanted to be family style, and so knowing each other, and actually, it would be weird to hang out with my family and never want to know how it's going on in their lives. You would feel like that's a distant family member. So it's that. We talked about it in the video, our corporate prayers, because we want our prayer to be participation. So not just one person praying and everyone listening. We wanted that interaction. So that's why we all pray together, and we let different people take turns leading it. The individual prayer flows out of those same values. It's the informal family style, and it's the participation. We could play with the format of it. We've talked about whether we might move it into the small group time. If we got bigger, rather than hear from 70 people, you could have your 8 or so people in your small group share. You'd still hear from people. We've talked about just different ways to do it. Let them write them down in advance, and I'll share them and pass them out so you can still share, but we can shore up the time. I think there's always, and please hear that, I think there's probably better ways to do lots of things we do. It's not that we've landed on the best way, but the values underneath of it are how we critique it. We don't want to say, oh, well, critique this thing just because it's not cool sounding enough. I mean, what's our value? And don't change it to something that does worse on that value. Change it to something that does it better. And
important to listen to people as to what they do like and what they don't like, because like part of the reason, like at Grace Community, I mean, they have 1,500 people now. If they just took, like just mention your prayer requests, which when they were small, up until they were probably like 300, 400 members, people would actually go up front and just talk and, on the mic and say what they were doing. But the thing was, they started getting a lot of complaints that like, so-and-so has been up there every week about this problem in their family.
We already have had some of those complaints come to me.
And I think it's important to listen to those complaints because they may be an indication of how you can change the service, because you
They
can
could be, but even in the worst case, let's say you get a complaint and you're thinking, there's just nothing I would change in response to that. Remember, our heart is discipleship, not performance. So one, I don't need to get defensive about a complaint. If we didn't look as awesome today as we could have, that's okay. It wasn't our goal. It makes it okay to hear that stuff out. We're really interested in the relationships. And one of the things we talked about in the Matthew model is we're interested in people's thinking and values. When someone comes to share something with you, a complaint, you're hearing their thinking and values. That's good. They chose to be vulnerable and open with you. And so rather than just, can I make that change, I need to be listening deeper. What are the values that drive this? In a lot of cases, our values aren't so distant, our application didn't match. And so I can affirm the common value and ask questions, okay, but if that's our value, if we throw this out entirely, is that really going to get us there? And they're going to go, oh, that's fair, but at least we could, and then and I think that looks a lot like what we see Jesus doing. He's like, well, you feed them. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees. And they're like, oh, no, we didn't bring bread. And he's like, remember the miracles where he multiplied bread? Not talking about bread. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees. And he throws it back out and lets them try again. And so you can have those moments where we can have a discussion, and we're more interested in just growing together than defending our service style. And if we come away with a good idea, cool. And if not, this wasn't a waste. Someone opened up on their thoughts and values. We got to have an exchange about our values. And if we help them value the right things by the end of that conversation, that's the important bit. So yeah, we want to be open for those conversations, even if it's the same conversation over and over. And that is where I actually think, when you have the one guy who comes to the mic and prays for the same thing every week, he's helping. He's cracking people open to have conversations with you. So he's a catalyst. Yeah. Well, any last thoughts on the video? I want to just overview. We're not going to go through 20 pages, but I want to overview what you got. Let me just talk about what you have in front of you, and then I'm just going to do the same thing, open the forum for what do you want to talk about. So first off, you see it says Group Leader Manual. That might seem weird to you, but kind of piggybacking off of Tom's comment. He said, well, what if we get too big? A lot of the questions about our structure hinge on, what if we get too big? And part of me says, well, we'll cry. Was that you burn that bridge when you get there? But it isn't something that we've, not thought about. Or it is something we thought about. I may not make double negatives. We've built the church to be a group of groups. We are the most multiplication-friendly design we could come up with. If we wanted to break out into two churches, that is easier than it was to start Christ House. When we started with Christ House, we had no groups. Nobody knows how to do it. We've got to model it on phase 1 and then move out to phase 2, and then grow into phase 3. To get to a point where we're too big and need to multiply, it's because we've been living in that phase 3 territory and we have just lots of groups. At that point, you take a couple groups that maybe live in the same area or all want to worship at the same time slot, or find a commonality that justifies it. And you would launch a new gathering, a new service, or a new church, depending if it's the same building or somewhere else, that would start with mature groups running. Would start with group leaders who already have been discipled up and are ready to disciple up others. So they would actually launch in the phase 2, phase 3 territory, probably phase 3. So in that sense, if we were staying in phase 3 and growing, we would be a multiplication-friendly church. And that's based on some things I've seen from other churches and stuff I think you can see in scriptures. Discipleship has like a slow start, but at a certain point it gets a little crazy. Because it's one reaches two who are able to reach two, rather than one reaching 20 or 100. But if everybody keeps reaching two who can reach two, there does come a point where the numbers get big. So we're not in it for numbers, we're in it for discipleship. And the math isn't perfect because not everybody you disciple turns around and disciple somebody else. They should, that's the goal, but it's not guaranteed. But we structured so that we're not forced to have to pick between our discipleship quality and our size. If we just think tweaking our style would compromise our values, well then let's view that as an invitation to do something new and to launch a new ministry, a whole new service or church. And so that's not scary for us. Our system is built for that actually to be like a really exciting milestone. And I think you should build for multiplication, and we're called to love that. So because our whole model is about life in groups, when it says group leader manual, you might have thought, well, why do I hold this? I'm not a group leader. But groups is kind of what we do, and we do it right here in the service. And so you could, and I thought about relabeling it just, our church manual, because it is. But our church runs on groups. And we've always, from early on, tried to share this material with everybody because we view everybody as a potential group leader. And everybody participating, knowing what the groups are about, is what makes our groups succeed and do well. So this isn't just for the group leaders. This is just how we like to roll. And if you're a group leader, you'll look at it more often. But you'll be a good group member if you get it. So there is an index in the front. It has been updated. Main thing is the appendix has swollen up to more pages. So some of it is, there's a big picture, and that is a lot of what we covered in the video. This is what I typed up when we actually went before the denomination and got formal approval to be a church plant, is this document went out. And it's got a picture of, Sunday being a gathering of groups, and that groups get sent out from there. So that really is in text form what the video is saying, in a little higher detail, a little less pretty. Then you get into small group conversations for growth, and this is more of advice on how to have good discussions rather than just monologue or ask bad questions that don't open discussions. So as a resource, and it's a collection of resources. Some of it's about how the main service functions in there. Some of it's how you can run your groups. There's the first 2 pages, I would say, is the simple, easy to run with. And then if you were still struggling, the next one is the pretty, using a lot of coaching advice on how to really cultivate conversations and dive into. If you've struggled with we had a good start of a conversation, it didn't go anyway. Some of the stuff on this second one gives you ways of how to start with a vague general discussion, drive it deeper, and then land it on something practical. So you actually get some goals that are actionable. So that's just kind of giving resources to make those groups really be growth conversations that go somewhere. Then you have the hands-on, and we talk about learning cycles. This is some what we were talking about, the model, share, release. And so it talks to them about how we use outreaches for growth. One of the things I found super useful, this comes from 3DM Material, which is another discipleship group that has pretty similar philosophy. 3DM, my only critique is the lead pastor, one, has fallen into sin and is out of ministry. That's a concern. But his strength was, some of his education was a sociologist, and so some of his writings, for me, I'm looking for more Bible chops. When I go, hey, here's our model, I'm like, it's the Matthew model. Now hang out in Matthew, I will give you the textual basis. He talks a lot about how people work and how people think and how people grow. And he looks at Scripture, and he ends up doing a lot of the same stuff we do. And so I've liked him because I think he's a better communicator than me. I don't like him because I think he's a worse Bible exegete, and I don't think you have to listen to me if I don't have Scripture on my side. But I want to give credit where credit's due. The square here comes from Mike Breen in the 3DM Material. And this idea of the model and release, he puts it into 4 stages, which is I do, you watch. I do, you help. You do, I help. You do, I watch. And I think when you're thinking through your roles, our goal isn't for group leaders to do everything, but I know there's seasons where they have to. But the goal should be that they're not doing it out of sight and in private and secret and just doing everything for their groups. We work together even if I'm carrying the weight so that you're getting a model. And then pretty early I want to invite people to start helping me with the goal that that can then shift. So like I'm going on a mission trip to Grenada next month. I'm bringing my newest director with me. He's never led a mission trip. This trip, I don't expect him to lead. He's never led one. He needs to see us lead a trip and see how we do mission trips in drama. So we at least start the trip with I do, you watch. And so I'll actually have a mime on the team, and just do some regular member stuff. And he and I are going to debrief each night and just talk about it. So I'm giving him a lot of room to watch and process. I'm hoping in the 12 days we're in Grenada that I can cross over into the help phase. And it's possible in some small one-off moments he could do things where I'm helping him. So he might lead an outreach while we're there, and I'll help him. We won't get to the release phase this trip. We will mostly be living in those first 2 steps. But if that goes well, then we can run another mission trip in a year or 2 where I will say, this is going to be more of you're hands-on from the beginning, and as much as possible you're going to do and I'm going to help. So I will do some things with you helping. You're going to do more and more things with me helping, with the goal being that by a 3rd mission trip, he runs it and I'm just tagging along to watch. And if that goes well, he doesn't need me the next trip. The next trip becomes him taking someone else to watch him. So that sort of sequence helps us be intentional. I encourage group leaders to always be thinking about who's a future group leader in your group that could start helping you. But even just for your whole group, ask them to start helping. A good, healthy group, the leader's not doing everything. He's supporting a group that's coming up with ideas and running it down themselves. So that's kind of just fleshing out how the hands-on can lead to a full discipleship cycle and growth. There's some sample debrief questions so that at the end of an outreach or an event you've done together, how do you discuss it well? And so I've given some ideas. Again, a lot of this is just trying to give resources, samples. Because at the end of the day, our discipleship is not just to make people good at doing random things, it's that they know Jesus and become like him. The gospel is the center. We're hoping that all of this leads to people understanding the good news of Jesus. So is just a little theological supplement at the end, which is the gospel, and I've got it in 2 lenses. The gospel as a narrative and the gospel as doctrines. That's probably the headiest section here. There'll be more of a, go home, read it, have fun, and you can ask me questions later. Then you get into my appendix. These are just resources I've made over the last 10 years for my group leaders to think about how to guide their groups and how to prompt them. One is to think about the fact that there's lots of ways to grow, and it's not new to me. Lots of churches use the up, in, out mindset we should be growing in all those ways, both growing upward in our worship of God, growing inward in our personal maturity and character, growing outward in our community and our outreach. And so I have that broken up. What would that look like as for a group rather than just thinking individual, but also the individual. And then for those of you guys that went on retreats with me, we've talked some about how to do accountability partners. And this is definitely just a resource out there, but what kind of questions can you ask in an accountability partner relationship, especially if it's new and you're learning how to open up? I have here Wesley's small group. So John and Charles Wesley were big on small group. John Wesley wrote up these questions as what they used in his small groups. It's I think it's overkill. I don't know that I could get through all those questions in my own meeting with somebody. But if you're struggling to have enough to talk about, this will get you going. So we had his small group questions. We have his band. They had the Holy Band was another group that he ran. These are the questions they asked in there. It's a little shorter. And then Church Multiplication Associates is a group that counsels churches on revitalization. They have some questions they suggested for small groups that I think are actually somewhat derivative off of Wesley, but tweaked and updated. So I just copied those in there as going, here's things I look at when I'm having an accountability relationship that I'm trying to get to open up more and go deeper. So that's there. And then the last page, when our small group plans to do something. I call it an event day because not every time is it a evangelistic outreach. Sometimes our small group's having a prayer retreat. Sometimes we're having a little worship session. Sometimes we're doing some community service. Sometimes we're doing... But whatever thing we're doing is our application. On the event day, how do we run that for discipleship? And so this is just an overview of being intentional to use those, not as just random things we did, but for growth. So, all right, that's a mouthful. That's the booklet. As you browse around, what are questions you have or areas where you're like, I'd like to know more about this? Or So this is kind of giving you.
Accountability partner, is that something that is forever, or is there a phase where you don't need accountability anymore, or is it just kind of like that's the pattern of a Christian is to always have an accountability partner?
So, on a biblical level, I have no Bible verse that says you have to have an accountability partner. So I think if we over-legalize this, Scripture's not on our side. What we're trying to do with accountability partners is to have the kind of Christian relationships that I think we are called to. We are called to have relationships where we confront each other, encourage each other, build each other up. But like those, I can give you verses for all those functions. I think those things are easiest to do one-on-one. So I view the formal choice of committing to have an accountability partner is about training yourself to have those kind of relationships with lots of Christians. So in one sense, should you ever not have an accountability partner, I hope there's never a phase in your life where you don't have people that you're regularly talking to and having those depth of relationships, because that's going to be a dangerous, unhealthy season. Might there be seasons where you don't have a formally assigned accountability partner? Yeah, that could happen, and it's not a sin. But because I know it's hard to cultivate that depth, and I think it's a weakness in our Western American culture. We're more of an anonymous culture that doesn't like to open up. I think it's a very logical guide rail to put on to say, my goal is to always have one. And I recognize I may need to change that up as schedules don't work or someone moves away, or because the thing itself is part of that bigger goal. I'm just trying to make sure there's a baseline that I've got somebody who has agreed to sacrifice to be available. Because we all get busy. Time flies by. So if you didn't have one, it's not that I can say you're sinning, but I do think it's a healthy part of our discipleship to keep encouraging our people to fight with, learning how to have deep, vulnerable conversations. But for me, I would say there's several folks who are past accountability partners. They're not current. They don't have that level of commitment to meet with me every week or every 2 weeks or whatever. But because we've had that in the past, when we get together, it always goes deep. We pick it up, and there's this deep encouragement. So the benefit of being in ministries that required me to have them perpetually for the last 20-something years is that I have a lot of men in my life who I can catch up with, have pray for me, be vulnerable. We've worked through the awkwardness, and that's a big blessing. And I recognize that that's really unusual in American culture, and actually really unusual in American Christianity. Even men tend to be loners and isolated. So yeah, our goal, that's why for a church we just said, so we just think everybody should have it. It's one of those values you're not going to see us, get all bent out of shape. If you're like, I don't have one, okay, well, let's start praying about who could be one. Okay, well, I've got some ideas. All right, go talk to them. And we're not sitting there watching the clock, because this is more just how we cultivate and encourage those deeper kind of relationships in our church. And so it's how we've applied one of those values. So I would say, yes, you should, but I think a person could tell me they don't need one, and if they actually have several very present, meaningful relationships in their life, not having it formally spelled out as an accountability is not a problem. I just would caution, be honest with yourself. Are you guys really stepping up and meeting enough? Because what I've experienced is I get lots of folks where we said, oh, yeah, we'd love to meet. We have great conversations, we do. We should meet. We should totally meet. Yeah, we should meet. We should totally meet. And years go by, and we just don't get it done. And so that's where it helps for me to just go, let's commit. Every 2 weeks, we're going to make something happen. That's just helpful.
I think it's important to have a definite idea in mind, not that you become legalistic about it, but if you just sort of say, yeah, we got to get together sometime, sometimes never going to occur. And I have several people in my life that, I know if I don't see them in a month, I need to call them, or they're going to be calling me, because we don't want it to
Have that
go
baseline.
2 or 3 months without talking to each other.
And none of those are your official accountability partner, right? You're just recognizing that's just a healthy relationship skill. And that's my point, is I think the accountability thing done well should be just about teaching healthy relationship skills. And that should translate, because, yeah, all relationships are good definition, communicating expectations, and being clear in the commitments with each other. That's good relationship skills, right? Every marriage needs that. Every friendship needs that. And to the degree you learn to do that, you're going to have better relationships and deeper relationships. And so, yeah, I know there can be ways you can go toxic with accountability. I think over legalism, I think making it only ever about the negative. So all we do is talk about our failures and then we go home. But that would be a toxic in any relationship, right? If you got a friend that's all we do is talk negative. We get together, we both talk about how terrible our lives are, and then go home. I wish you better friendships than that. But I hope you have friends where you can share what didn't go well. You need that, and folks who celebrate the victories, and folks who sometimes you get together and just laugh. So accountability in some ways is just like friendship boot camp for Christian friendship. Other thoughts or questions? I mean, by giving you 20 pages, if there's something you wanted to talk about, it's probably in there somewhere. We're mostly just talking about how we do discipleship in Christ House. Trish?
Is there a video on YouTube about accountability partners?
I've been looking for a good resource. I've not found one that's like copy and paste, send to you. In the membership curriculum, we talk about it some. I don't think I found a video in there that I liked, and I know when I was making the membership curriculum, I tried really hard to find shareable videos that were. And part of it is, in a lot of sectors, when they say accountability, they really do mean that more legalistic thing. You're joining a discipleship program for the next 15 weeks, and you have to have an accountability partner where you will confess, and usually it's explicitly we're going to talk about sexual sins, and it's very shaped, it's very intense, and I'm not even going to say that's all bad. I think if you walked over into AA, there's a degree to which they do that, where they have a sponsor who is an accountability who asks them about alcohol, directly. When you're in a place of specific brokenness and entrenched sin, that kind of intense accountability is like a cast. It's not how you hope to live your whole life, but you might need it for a season. The danger in making that sort of a whole life normal, it's like casts are good if you have a broken foot, but if you think you need to wear a cast 24/7, something's off. And so when you confuse deep, just good Christian accountability with a cast, then it's something I only need when something's really broken or messed up. In fact, if I need it, I guess something is broken up. It's kind of a negative thing that you needed it. It seems like you failed. And so much of the material I've found so far looked at accountability through that lens. I found more videos attacking accountability as this overly negative, toxic thing that Christians need to chill out on. And then they describe accountability and be like, well, yeah, I'm not for that either. And that wasn't my personal experience of accountability. I've had some great accountability partners. So I don't have a video at this point, and I would say even as you look around, be careful you're not finding, and there's a place for it, but it's not what we're talking about, that intense, heavily legalistic thing.
I've never known accountability.
Yeah. Find somebody who's had it. So ideally, and doesn't always work. So like in the drama ministry, we require the kids to have accountability partners, and we actually assign them their partner, and we rotate it every session. Now, the reason we do that is we're hoping they learn to have those kind of relationships for life. But I'm assuming if I have a 13-year-old joining, what's the odds they've ever had a good accountability partner? Almost zero. Like, what 13-year-old's already got great experience with accountability? They just heard the word. So we're often intentionally pairing new members with older members, and we're listening to members talk about how accountability went for them, and we're trying to take folks who said they had a good accountability relationship and put them with somebody who's never had one, so that there can be that modeling and that sharing. And when you're doing that, then over time we get to a place where I can kind of pair them up very freely because I think everybody's had some exposure. So that works if you have at least some people, who've had good experiences. If neither of you have, then you just need to explore it together. Be having honest conversations. How's this going? What's not going well? How could we do better? And be willing to try stuff. And I would say also, don't be afraid to. No, there's no shame in saying, "Hey, this isn't working. Let me try somebody else."
What would you say, and is it important to even recognize the difference between accountability between two people, which I tend to think of as more equal, like somebody's good at this and somebody better than that, and what's iron sharpens iron, and being in a mentor student, for lack of a better way of saying it, and can you think of any other type of relationships that we should be mindful of?
So the difference between accountability, even if there's difference in skill levels and like a mentor-student, is the authority. Accountability is we're coming, in equal standing. Whereas if you say, Tim, would you mentor me? We're agreeing that I'm going to give you authority on this thing that you're going to listen to. And so that's going to have a bit more of a didactic where I'm going to say, no, let's just do this. I'm going to assign you this. I'm going to ask you to do this. Whereas accountability, I can challenge you and you can challenge me. I think we're misguided sometimes when we assume, like, just because I'm more mature, I have to be the mentor. Or if they're mature, that has to be more of a mentor-student. Because if so, how do pastors find accountability partners in their own church? And I know some pastors would say, well, they just never do. They would never be vulnerable with a church member. They have to have outside accountability with another pastor, preferably an older, because they've got that. But you all have the Holy Spirit in you. So there is potency in every last person here. If you've accepted Christ, He puts His Holy Spirit in you. And so I do think we can have an iron sharpening iron relationship, even if there's differences in maturity. And a part of that is maturity is not flat, right? There's areas that I'm mature in, and there are areas I'm not. Right? In the drama ministry, to this day, they still don't want me to handle checks because I'm just terrible with handling the money. So I'm not mature in ministry? Well, in some areas, and in some areas I'm still growing. And I've grown in that area from where I was. It's just got a ways to go. And so, again, when I'm working with young people, it's a little simpler. But I think as we grow, the complexity just amplifies. But even with young people, there's going to be areas where their innocence just beautifully shines and they can really challenge an older person. And other areas where the older person has a lot to offer. And so I think you can come in that accountable. It's more that we agree that we're going to have this equal listening, and neither of us is here to drop a plan on the other, but to conversationally exhort, confront, and encourage, and that mutual back and forth we can allow to happen. For the older person, it might take some humility. Let that kid talk, and listen when he says, "Hey, I'm just a little concerned when you say this. Seems something's off there. Do you think so?" For the young person, it takes some boldness to say, I've been invited to walk with this person, I'm going to speak up. But I've had some very young, I've had more young accountability partners than not because of doing so many years in youth ministry, and I've been very, very, very blessed by them. So for me, it's not a hypothetical. I'm very comfortable saying young people have helped me grow.
I have a little bit of a topic shift question. So I was wondering, I think a lot of other churches view, like, the pastor is like the shepherd over the flock, which in some sense that is biblical. And they have that, like, the pastor should be the one going to, like, individuals and checking on them, like saying, hey, how are you doing? What's going on in your life? I was wondering what your view of that is in the context of Christ House. Is it more like, or like this model, like is the pastor, if he sees an individual struggling or just seems like they need to be checked on, does he go to them directly, or does he go to the group leader and say, hey, why don't you go talk to this person and invest in them and see what's going on? Like, what is the role of the pastor overall, like of the as the shepherd of the flock, kind of a situation?
So the shepherding. So part of our goal in having the structure we have is that at least those things are still a flow that goes back to the pastor. So it wouldn't be that I think, the pastor doesn't have a responsibility there, and so I don't view them as either or. Well, if the group leaders can be involved, then the pastor shouldn't. So it comes sometimes down to a case by case. And part of why I want to have a structure with the group leaders, so when our groups are running, I'm usually trying to meet with the group's leaders with some regularity. Because it can also happen the other way. I didn't see an issue, because the group leaders see these people more. And maybe the issue wasn't manifesting on Sunday, or any of the particular outreaches I was at, but they're seeing it in group. And the group leader says, that's a heavy issue, and I don't know what to do. they can actually escalate an issue up to me. So if I see an issue, some of it's going to come down to, if it's a small issue and I'm right there, I might just deal with it. Why be weird and I saw this, but run over Nate, you know. But sometimes if it's a small issue and it's a great teachable moment, and I want to give Nate a chance to grow in that area, maybe I would, because I'm like, no damage is done letting this sit for a little bit. Hey, Nate, did you notice that person seems like they're just really insecure on this, and I think, there's some ways we can encourage them in the group, and can you speak into that? Sometimes we can both do it. We had some scenarios. I've invited Johnny to join me on worship time, right? So the first time he led worship, there was things we could have critiqued. And Joel came to me because he saw some of them. And I said, well, this is a discipleship moment. He stepped up. He's doing hands-on. That's what we want. Because he's doing hands-on, we're seeing areas he can grow. That's what we want. I'm seeing it. You're seeing it. And so Joel asked me, he said, well, then who should talk to him? I said, I think both of us. So when the service ends, I'll chat with him. And then you make a plan this week to chat with him as well. And we get to tag team as pastor and dad in encouraging your kid to grow. Johnny and I had a really great conversation. Half the stuff he had seen himself, he's like, oh, well, I did this and this. That wasn't cool. I was like, great. This is exactly how you hope this goes down. And, and so then I could snag Joel on his way out and tell him how it went to hand off to him to do a follow-up at home. And by both of us tag teaming, we could nurture him and make this helping with worship a discipleship opportunity. So it's not either or. It's not that the pastors abdicate it. But there are times where you need a pastoral authority because the issue is very dicey, very doctrinally relevant. And so if it comes down where there's a big doctrinal question or severity, marriage is falling apart, someone's having demonic interactions, that's where me meeting regularly with the group leaders gives us a chance to ask. And so you remember we had Thomas as the fellow we ended up church disciplining. Early on, he was in one of our groups causing a lot of turmoil, and one of the regular conversations I was having with the group leaders, do I need to step in? And he was like, well, let me try another week, let me try that, And I don't know that we nailed that perfectly, but that was the conversation, because I was recognizing this was on that level where it might not be appropriate for a group leader to shoulder this. And then that's my job as a pastor to take it on. And ultimately, it did wind up being me taking it on. And it did go all the way to discipline. We're not asking a group leader to walk somebody all the way through discipline. That really should have escalated up to the pastor before we get there. But I don't think it's healthy for pastors to be the one trying to do all of that. Even in a small church like ours, to have me be the primarily responsibility for 35 people would already be unhealthy. Imagine that in a church of 100 church. You have to, good leadership shares and delegates. And this is our delegation structure.
I guess the topic is sex. Should a man and a woman who aren't married be accountability partners? Should a married person be accountable with a person of another sex?
Right.
Should,
as far as their official accountability partner, I don't recommend it, no. Could you, because here's the thing, that's a person you're practicing trying to learn how to have deeper and deeper accountability. And there's limits to how deep you can go in cross-gender. You can have, in churches, women can encourage men and men can encourage women. That's not evil, but there's limits to it, especially when there's a marriage and there's another relationship that needs to be protected and a depth that this isn't allowed to go to. So the struggle is that you can't really practice that far. If this is your accountability where I'm trying to learn how to have deeper, more accountable, and I want to be able to talk about anything, well, no, there are certain conversations you shouldn't have cross-gender. And so for your primary accountability partner, no, I wouldn't be down with it. That said, I think we can blow that out of proportion to make it sound like guys only talk to men. The women should be total strangers to you your whole life. They are the mystery that sits on the other side of the church. We could do that. Men sit on this side, women's, make it even easier. And I think, no, I think that's not biblical. There's plenty of places in Scripture where we see men and women talking to each other and encouraging each other. So we can have a basis for that. I mean, what's his name? Priscilla and Aquila have their... Priscilla... Who's the guy they confront? There's another Greek teacher. And it's a husband and wife team that pull aside and update him on the gospel. And so they didn't say like the wife stayed back and the husband only. It seemed like both of them encouraged him and had a doctrinal conversation, and he would benefited for it. So that's okay. But they didn't she didn't become his accountability partner.
Husbands and wives consider themselves accountability partners?
Lots of strong debates on that in Christian circles. I would say yes, but not everybody agrees with me. I can't imagine holding back sharing with my wife, and I'd like to stay that way. I think that's a hard-fought intimacy. Where you usually hear counselors and stuff struggle is just when you have a very broken relationship and the trust is hurt, you might need extra helps to get there. And as you guys rebuild trust, starting off with just, you might dig a hole you don't know how to deal with. And so those are settings where they sort of say, each of them needs to have an accountability partner. And I still, Christy is not my only accountability. So if I could kind of balance the thing, if you make your spouse your only accountability, there's a danger in putting too much pressure where your spouse has to be everything for you. They can't, and so you just set each other up for failure and frustration. Plus, when the failure is between the two of you, which, because I'm around Christy a lot, a very high percentage of my sinning is either with her or to her, right? So that's where another accountability is helpful, because she's not a neutral party in that mess. But that doesn't mean she's not my accountability. She sees me better than anybody else. So I'm not a fan of, because I've known some couples, well, my wife's my accountability, so I don't need any, and she says the same, and you get these isolated couples, and that's not healthy. You need to be part of the church, not just your family. But I've heard reaction the other way, where I've even heard counselors say, well, just, you're wrestling with this thing, your wife never needs to know. And that's just, all kinds of red flags go up in my mind when I hear that kind of language. She needs to know. We can talk about a loving way to share with her, and that can even include timing and place, but our goal is open, is intimacy in the marriage, and intimacy should be, I can share freely and fully. So I really think they should be your deepest partner. But as somebody who spent a lot of his life single, I had some amazing accountability partners in my singleness. I don't feel like I missed out. So have both. Christy and I both had the privilege of deep spiritual friendships before we met each other. That helped us date well, helped us be engaged well and marry well, and we still have those friends deeply involved in our lives. So it enhances. Excellent question. Other thoughts, and you can go to other areas of how we do discipleship in Christ House. This is just meant to kind of get your heads into what we're doing, understand how we come at it, and how to make the most of the opportunities we have. Like I said, we can build a nice structure if we don't use it for what it's for. It's just a structure sitting on a shelf. Okay, we have 20-page document. Wow, our church takes discipleship so seriously. Okay, but if we don't do it, it's a pretty document. Other thoughts, things that you were encouraged by in there, or things that you'd like to know more about?
Kind of a rabbit trail and a loaded question, and I'm not sure how to ask it.
Those are usually the good ones.
If I'm understanding kind of the heart of discipleship, it seems like you need two things. You need a place where somebody can be discipled. So somebody who's willing to disciple and structures in place to make that happen. But then you also need someone who wants to be discipled. Seems like that's kind of a prerequisite.
Yeah.
And being in circles where it was kind of, I don't know, in youth ministries especially, I felt in youth groups where you're kind of babysitting Christian kids, but trying to force them to be discipled. But I've thought about it a little bit as an adult, on the positive side of youth ministry, I feel like youth are fun to work with because they're moving, their life is moving towards something. They're becoming adults. If they're ministry-minded, they're interested in growing and being developed. I feel like us as adults, you get to a place where you kind of gotten established in your career and your development, and then you're just more go from this uphill climb to just kind of a coasting. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that can translate into church as well, where I'm coming to church more as a rhythm then as a progression towards something.
Yeah, my youth years was when I was super hungry and would take anything I could show up at. As an adult, I'm just looking for a maintainable time slot.
I feel like, especially in our American Christianity, you accept Jesus, but there's not necessarily this high expectation of vibrancy after that in evangelism and discipleship. So I guess what I'm getting at is how do we approach ourselves or those around us who maybe are not interested in discipleship? How do you approach that with other Christians, if that makes sense?
Yeah, because you're right. With like youth group, sometimes you have kids that are being straight up forced to show up. Grandma's worried about them or whatever. But sometimes with church, you have people just showing up because that's just what I do. Same issue. What I see in the Gospels, I look at Matthew's Gospel, you've got these two groups, the crowds and the disciples. They are different. But Jesus does minister to both. So in recognizing some folks are not at a point where they're wanting that discipleship and they're committing. Without that want to and commitment, I can't really disciple very much. That doesn't mean there's no place for them, because I think that's the mistake in sort of a discipleship ministry focus. A lot of discipleship ministries, either you sign up for the 15-week course or nothing. We need to have an approach that has room for the crowds and the disciples. And the disciples often come out of the crowds. Jesus will preach to the multitudes, and at the end of the sermon, he's getting ready to hop on the boat, and a guy comes and says, "Lord, I'll follow you anywhere," and then Jesus challenges him, and we don't know if he followed or not. But that's a disciple, or at least a potential disciple, coming out of the crowd ministry. So we want to keep making sure there's places where people who have not yet made a strong commitment can come and be around it. And then we want to develop a culture that is high invite, high challenge, that we're always inviting people into discipleship and challenging people to embrace the costs of discipleship, because that's what I see Jesus doing. It's not, here's the crowd, and then so they're all disciples. He preaches to the crowd, but then he challenges them, or he invites them, come follow me. Take up your cross, follow me. And he'll preach those hard things to the whole crowd at times. And then those who respond become disciples. So for us, we do want our church service, while it has elements of discipleship in it, it is a low bar of entry gathering. So this can be a mixed multitude of crowd and disciples. You can come, but in this environment, there is this challenge and invitation. Okay, we're going into small groups, and we're going to have a discussion. So you're getting invited in that deeper. You could decide if, we can't make anyone talk in a small group, and we try to be nice if they don't want to, but we are inviting and in a sense challenging them to embrace that. And we're constantly talking about, hey, groups are launching, we want to see you get into a group. And so that high invite, high challenge is what I see Jesus doing, and we try to model that, to have a crowd event that feeds into the deeper discipleship, where the crowds are constantly being invited and challenged. And then that's a conversation I have with group leaders regularly, is maybe such and such has potential to step up. Well, maybe we need to go invite them into it. I got into discipleship myself. I showed up at a workshop that a traveling ministry was putting on. And that would have been all that happened if it wasn't for they then invited me. During the workshop, on 2 different occasions, people from the ministry grabbed me and said, hey, seems like you have a heart for this stuff. We would love to see you hit the road with us. And that direct invite, I responded to and said, you know what, let's do it. And I signed up, so they got a commitment out of me. And then when I hopped on the road into that committed environment, I grew a ton. But I mean, if they weren't doing a ministry for non-committed homeschoolers who just wanted to do some mime, where would I ever have gotten the invite to step in? So I'm not against ministries, even youth ministries that are low commitment, teaching the gospel regularly. That can be that crowd event. Jesus does that perpetually. But that's not all we want to do. We should always be inviting and challenging the crowds into discipleship. Because, I think at all of our seasons of life, we need that fresh nudge. Because the thing I hear a lot is people go, well, you get excited, they get crazy when they're youth. Youth gets on fire, and that's great for youth. Youth do that, and it won't last. When you grow up, you chill out. And so that's what I like to share my testimony, is going, my kid who went on a mission trip and forgot to chill out afterwards, because I'm still kind of running mission trip style. So you don't have to. It's just that we've given adults a pass. So while the youth environment can be hard because of the forced kids, I still see more discipleship happening in youth environments because the kids, I think a big part is the kids, when they make a commitment, it's almost impossible for it to be near as expensive for a kid to commit as it is for an adult. If they give everything, they don't have much responsibility. Everything was not expensive. Whereas I have 2 daughters. I have a mortgage. I have mouths to feed. I have a wife, So when I put a lot on the table, the responsibilities are much heavier. That same time commitment is a lot more expensive for an adult. So adults are called to embrace a costly commitment. I think we just feel it a lot more. Still necessary. But that's part of why I think the temptation is to say, well, disciple the young people, and then once it gets expensive, let's all just chill out. But when I've seen adults go ahead and make the cost, we grow a lot too. Growth still happens. All ages. Does that at least speak to what you were looking at? All right. Well, time-wise, we're where I want to wrap. And I'm pretty sure my furnace is off again. I can feel the temperature dropping back. So, take these home. Read over it. Browse over it. Bare minimum, as you're sitting in your small group, we're going to relaunch them in March. Be a great small group member. But also, I just hope it gives you a resource. And as you're reading through it, obviously 20 pages here, we just browsed it. You get questions? Always happy to talk about this stuff. This is the stuff that gets me excited. I'd love to chat, clarify, and maybe you'll help me add a couple more pages before the next time we print it. So, as I said, would not imagine that we're doing it all perfectly. All of this can be critiqued and changed in light of the values. So, all right. Well, let me pray for us. Father, at the end of the day, we want to be more like Jesus. We have our ideas and our approaches, our structures. We don't want to lose sight of the goal in the midst of it. Would you bless our church that we would be individually and corporately seeing more and more of the likeness of your Son in our midst and making your Son more visible to those around us? Bless our church with that witness. And so I pray for tonight we'd go home with hearts stirred and prompted in ways that we can grow deeper with him. So bless each one in that way. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, guys. Questions are always the fun part.